a minute. So if you want to go ahead and take your seats, get your earphones in, get some coffee, and we'll get going in about a minute here. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So good morning to all those tuning in from the East Coast or the United States. Good evening to those tuning in from Asia and everywhere else in between. Thank you all for joining us today. We're here to launch the newest online course from the Stimson Strategic Learning Initiative launched by the South Asia program, the course being entitled Deterrence in Southern Asia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already. Hopefully some of you have already enrolled in the course and started to peruse its content. But the online course seeks to sharpen analysts' understandings of strategic concepts in Southern Asia and beyond, but also introducing a diverse set of expertise and making it accessible to students, scholars, and practitioners and so that they can all learn from each other. I'm just going to give a little bit of background. By the way, I should have introduced myself. My name is Samir Lalwani. I direct the South Asia program here at the Stimson Center and a senior fellow here. And I have the good fortune to just open these convenings, but then I'll be turning it over to my colleague Zeba Fazli and this eminent panel of scholars from across the region and the United States to take it from there. But I thought I'd start off by just giving a little bit of background on the origin story of the online course initiatives, as well as this discussion topic of deterrence in Southern Asia. So as some of you know, our co-founder of the Stimson Center, Michael Crepon, who is also the founder of the South Asia program, was a big proponent of articulating and seeking to understand varying perspectives on deterrence. I think this goes back to sort of his reading of Schelling, Halperin, Jervis, that communication on these concepts was as central to deterrence stability as much as the military modernization complex for command and control, that communication element was central to it. But he also anticipated that there would be a time when we wouldn't be as easily able to communicate, whether because of declines in relations, because of travel restrictions, or because of a cataclysmic pandemic that would sweep the globe. And so in this case, Michael was extremely prescient in thinking that we needed to have some sort of virtual and online platform where we could exchange ideas, both asynchronously as well as simultaneously. And that asynchronous learning could be a tool for scholars, for students, professors, but also for practitioners to better understand each other's concepts of deterrence and theories of strategy and stability. And so I think the project was launched almost a decade ago, and the construction of this course began several years ago, and has undergone many revisions, iterations, test runs, and The final product here today we think is the best product and really proud of it, but we always are learning and growing and adapting. And so we'd welcome more feedback from all of you, as well as people who will watch this down the road, and to sort of give us inputs on how we can improve the course, because it can be a dynamic course, it doesn't have to be static. So let me answer a question that sort of has been posed routinely to us, which is why the concept of Southern Asia as opposed to South Asia. So we've had this program of South Asia around for 30 years, at least at the Stimson Center. But we've come to realize over the last decade, and certainly the last 5 years, that it is impossible to discuss strategic dynamics in South Asia without thinking about both China and the United States. They both have inescapable influences on the region: political, economic, and military. We tested this idea actually back in the summer of 2017. We had a big conference on strategic dynamics in Southern Asia, and then that evolved into an online series with partnership with War on the Rocks, where we had a series called Southern Discomfort. That seemed to be very successful. A lot of contributions to that series. It got widely read across the world. And simultaneous, or not simultaneous, but soon after that, the United States really started to emphasize the role, the congruence of this region with its language about the Indo-Pacific. And after rebranding the Asia-Pacific as the Indo-Pacific in South Asia, this became really clear that this was a fluid environment. And so Southern Asia really stuck for us and seemed to work for a lot of our interlocutors. So we're employing that concept. Some people might disagree with it, but we find it to be a useful concept to understand the region. The last thing I want to do before I turn it over to Zeba is just to thank all the people, the ideas, the investors into this project who made this all possible. So of course, our supporters and investors for a long time have included the Carnegie Corporation of New York, MacArthur Foundation, the Stanton Foundation, U.S. Department of Energy, and they've really been the big backers of this effort and this objective of widening the strategic discourse, both in terms of ideas, but also interlocutors. I also want to thank the team that has been working on this for several years, many of whom have moved on to bigger and better things, but they deserve recognition for all the time and intellectual effort they put into this. And that would include Travis Wheeler, Hamza Shad, Heather Byrne, Jillian Gaynor. But most important has been our fearless project leader, Zeba Fazli, who's invested blood, sweat, and tears into this initiative, into this online course, and rightfully deserves to be leading this event today. And so with that, I'm going to cease my talking and turn it over to Zeba, but also congratulate her for a fantastic course and a fantastic initiative. Zeba, over to you.
Thank you so much, Samir. I really appreciate it. And hello to everyone joining us from around the world. I am so thrilled to be here and celebrating with you all and to moderate what's sure to be a really engaging discussion with our fantastic panelists who I'll introduce shortly. I'll just preview by saying that we'll be interspersing audience questions throughout this event. So I encourage you in the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Please be sure to share your name and affiliation as you're submitting. Now, to introduce our fantastic panelists, they are from across Southern Asia and the US, and they are among the 60+ experts featured in the Deterrence in Southern Asia course. So first, I'll introduce Rabia Akhtar, who is Director for the Center for Security, Strategy, and Policy Research at the University of Lahore in Pakistan. Thank you so much, Rabia. Wonderful to see you. Next up, we have Christopher Clary, an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany, and as it happens, a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center South Asia program. Hi, Chris, great to see you. Next, we have Happyman Jacob, an Associate Professor of Disarmament Studies at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. Wonderful to see you, Happyman. Thank you so much for joining. And last, but by no means least, we have Tong Zhao, a Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is based in Beijing at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Thank you for joining us, Tong. I know how late it is for you, so I'm really appreciative of your joining us today. Now, before we get into the discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the course, Deterrence in Southern Asia. As Samir was saying, this has been in development for over 2 years, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved since I first started at Stimson, and it's been such a rewarding experience for me and a labor of love for all of us at the South Asia program over the last couple of years, and for so many of us across Stimson. So I want to echo his thanks and congratulations to everyone who's had a hand in this course, because it's been a team effort, and we're incredibly proud of the final product. Now, we built this course to very intentionally engage with diverse perspectives about deterrence from experts across Southern Asia. And I think its driving question, the theme at its heart, so to speak, is how can we apply deterrence as a theory that's coming from a bipolar Cold War context to modern day Southern Asia? Now, to talk about this a little bit more and actually show you some of the content of the course, I'd like to share our course trailer, which is available on the Stimson Center YouTube and on the Strat Learning website.
Over the past few decades, several states have been involved in competition, crises, and conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, including India, Pakistan, China, and the United States. Understanding the complex forces that shape relationships in this region may help reduce the risk of potentially devastating conflicts. That's why the Strategic Learning Initiative, a project of the Stimson Center, is releasing Deterrence in Southern Asia, a new, free online course that explores security dynamics in this important and increasingly contested region. This course traces deterrence theory from its origins in the Cold War to Southern Asia today. It asks, what can we learn from theory and history? And how can we use those lessons to better understand competition and crisis behavior in Southern Asia and around the world?
Deterrence theory is useful not just for students of Southern Asia, but wherever nuclear dyads exist, it's the idea of deterrence that works.
It has not only impacted the security aspect, but it has also impacted the political side and the economic sides of both states. So I think it's very important for the students to understand the security dynamics and what role nuclear weapons have played in that regard.
Studying the Cold War, looking at what's happening in South Asia, looking at US and China, it really does matter for the world.
This course is a one-of-a-kind opportunity to learn from some of the sharpest scholars, analysts, and practitioners from China, India, Pakistan, the United States, and beyond. It's designed for anyone interested in security and strategic issues, whether you're new to the field or an experienced hand. And it's totally free. We hope you'll explore what this course has to offer, and we welcome your thoughts and feedback on our social media pages where you can engage with other strategic learners. Enroll in Deterrence in Southern Asia at www.stratlearning.org.
Wonderful. And now I'd like to very quickly go to a slideshow that describes a little bit more about what the course offers. There we go. We can go to the first slide. Awesome. So again, Deterrence in Southern Asia, we see as a really unique and valuable resource for understanding and analyzing key topics for everything from deterrence theory to deterrence relationships to historical crises from the Cold War to the present, and getting around kind of the traditional India-Pakistan dyad that we've talked about for so long. It's really meant to help you, the student, develop and sharpen your own ideas and your own analysis, no matter what your background is or where you are in your career. Now, what follows, we can go to the next slide, yay. Then what follows is a very non-exhaustive list of concepts that we cover in the course that includes everything from the strategic chain to deterrence and compellence and the theory of the nuclear revolution and so much more. And to the right there is an example infographic that kind of lays out the core frame that we use in building the course. So we have things like this and interactive elements, as we saw in the trailer, throughout, and they're really high quality and easy to understand, which is why, if we can go to the next slide, yay. This is why that we think that this course is going to be a unique and valuable resource, especially for professors and students who are currently going through remote learning and may well be for some time. So we have several ways that you can incorporate deterrence in Southern Asia into your classroom or your curriculum. You can promote it or simply recommend it as you would extra reading for students to do on their own time. You can integrate it or parts of it as supplemental content. You can assign the whole course and have your students complete it and earn a certificate for their efforts. Or you can partner with us, and our team at the Strategic Learning Initiative can work more closely with you or your class or your institution. We also offer a whole host of instructor resources on our website. This includes everything from key terms glossaries to example lesson plans, reading lists, and full downloadable versions of our case studies. And we're always developing more, so please do keep an eye out. Now to sum up on that last slide. Awesome. So you can see all of this and more at our website, www.stratlearning.org. You can enroll in either the complete edition, which is the one that will award you a certificate for when you complete it, or a flex version if you're more interested in specific parts of it or just exploring more. So if you have any questions, please do let us know. But again, we're super excited and proud of this course and hope that you'll all sign up and start your strategic learning journeys. Now for the main event, I'd like to begin our moderated discussion. There we go. With our panel of experts. I'll start with a few questions of my own, but again, I do hope that you'll submit your questions in the Q&A box and we will try to get to as many as we can. Again, please do share your name and your affiliation with us as you're submitting. Now to kick us all off, I'd like to ask our speakers to consider what we just saw in the trailer about the course. And I wanted to ask your opinion. Why should strategic analysts study deterrence in Southern Asia? In other words, why is a course like this important and what can students gain from taking it? So we can go around the panel, start with Rabia and then go up to Happymon, then Tong, then Chris. As a reminder, speakers, please do try to keep your responses to about 2 minutes each. So Rabia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Zeba. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me for this launch event of the second wonderful online course run by Stimson on deterrence in Southern Asia. It is a great opportunity for people across the globe to learn from rich material on deterrence presented in this course, irrespective of whether you are a layman or an expert. There's something here for everyone. Coming to your question, part A, why should strategic analysts study deterrence in South Asia? Strategic analysts, the global body of scholars, I believe, find South Asia, and I might be using this term interchangeably, South Asia, Southern Asia, so bear with me, to be fascinating, primarily due to characteristics that are unique to South Asian countries, namely India and Pakistan, and China to some extent. And to me, that uniqueness is anchored in the unpredictability of their nuclear relationship, which is singularly determined by their crisis behavior. Pakistan and India of 1998 are not the Pakistan and India of 2020, and they won't be the same in 2030. Their nuclear dyadic relationship has evolved since overt nuclearization with intense periods of hostility and peace. The two nuclear dyads, Pakistan and India and China in this region, have also seen some overlap with the threat matrix getting more complex for the three nuclear countries that share borders, which has changed the character of the nuclear competition in this region. That is why our region is and will remain relevant for strategic analysts because deterrence dynamics will continue to shift and take shape, and the lens would need to be updated if some understanding is to be achieved. As to why this course is important and what students gain from it, as an academic, I can tell you that neither in Pakistan nor in India, no one institution, academic or policy think tank, has accomplished what you at Stimson have done. You've compiled all resources on nuclear South Asia in one place, made it open and free for all, and invited everyone, irrespective of their titles and expertise, to join and learn. We who are based in this region have not been able to collate such materials when we should have. So, for a student who is interested in learning about nuclear South Asia, all they need to do is enroll in your course and get the certification of learning. And the best part is that you are not projecting one narrative. It is not agenda driven, as might have been commonly misperceived. You have in these courses Pakistanis, Indians, Americans, and Chinese experts who have freely spoken about these issues from their own perspectives without Stimson having colored it or directed it in one direction to reinforce any one country's deterrence or strategic perspectives. And that is the best part about it. We use some of these resources from your Nuclear South Asia course in our own summer courses and refer to talks and materials you have put together, and it was a great success. The space we have given to Pakistani strategic studies scholars like myself, Dr. Naim Salek, Dr. Mansoor Ahmed, Sadia Tasleem, Sitara Noor, Saeed Alizia Jafri, Mohammad Faisal, Lieutenant General Wahid Arshid, and Brigadier Feroz Hassan Khan has allowed us to share Pakistan's perspective on deterrence dynamics in the region. So congratulations to you and your team at Stimson's South Asia program for enriching and advancing the knowledge base on all things nuclear South Asia through your free online learning platform. I look forward to incorporating the deterrence course in our curriculum too at some point in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabia. Again, the summer course was such a success, and we always appreciate your support. Happy One, would you chime in, please? You're muted, Happy One. You're muted again, sorry.
Okay.
There you go.
Right. First of all, congratulations to the Stimson Center, Seva, yourself, Samir, all of you there for really putting this together, this fantastic course. I can tell you that a lot of my own students at JNU are going through this course and learning a lot from this. It makes our job also easy in some ways. So thank you for doing that. I'm delighted that you are using the word Southern Asia, phrase Southern Asia rather than South Asia. You know, back in India and in Pakistan, Rabia, myself, all of us are used to talking about South Asia rather than Southern Asia. I think it is time that we started talking about Southern Asia. And I think you've done a wonderful job of making it more inclusive and bringing all these voices together. To really look at a region that deserves to be looked at. And I think there are several substantive reasons why strategic analysts, students, practitioners around the world should study the how deterrence operates in South Asia. To begin with, this is clearly an active theater of conflict with three nuclear armed states. Of these two dyads, one dyad, India and Pakistan, since 2016 have not been talking to each other on strategic issues, on nuclear issues. In fact, of late we have not been talking to each other on anything. You know, so so you have that one dyad there, and then the second dyad, India and China, have almost never talked about nuclear issues with each other. We've never had a nuclear conversation with each other, and I assume that's probably the case. Although it's not necessarily a nuclear dyad between China and Pakistan. I don't know what is the state of nuclear conversation between these two countries, but clearly the fact that these two dyads have never really engaged in nuclear conversations, I think is a worrying is deeply worrying, and I think that makes it really interesting for students and observers to sort of look at Southern Asia and sort of understand what's happening here. Secondly, I think the interplay of sub-conventional, conventional, and nuclear strategies in Southern Asia also makes it a very, very interesting study. Unlike in the Cold War setting between the United States and USSR, you have a very, very different setting here where you're looking at the cross-domain at several levels, at the sub-conventional, conventional, and nuclear levels. You have a certain strategizing that's happening. And I think this needs to be looked at very closely, studied very closely from an intellectual point of view to really understand what is going on. And I think thirdly, in a substantive sense of the term, the rise of China and India's perception of China as a threat, and India's increasing concern about a two-front situation for itself, wherein you have China on the east and Pakistan on the northwest, and of course you have an active situation within Kashmir, and I think these concerns about two-front situation and what that might mean for deterrence in South Asia is, I think, yet another reason why we should study deterrence in South Asia with a lot more interest. And this was not a big worry earlier on. So 10 years ago, there was not too much worry in India about this two-front situation. But today, I think this has become a real worry. And I think we are probably going to discuss more of that later on. Now, again, of these three states in Southern Asia, one country, India, has a page-long nuclear doctrine. Pakistan and China haven't really articulated their nuclear doctrines. And so there is a lot of, lack of clarity when it comes to what really are we talking about here, when it comes to concepts, when it comes to, theories, when it comes to how these three countries understand certain terms which we think are universally understood? Do they really understand these things at all in a sort of common manner? So in the absence of clearly laid down nuclear doctrines on the one hand, and the absence of any nuclear conversation among them on the other, despite being in an active state of conflict, I think should make Southern Asia a region of interest. This also means, I mean, all of this also means we are in some ways groping in the dark in the region when it comes to deterrent stability. So I think what I'm trying to say basically, Zeba, is that hey, here is if you don't study this region carefully, Southern Asia and deterrent stability in Southern Asia carefully, you are missing out on how nuclear deterrence works, functions in other parts of the world. I think so people in the West should therefore look at what is happening here and study what is happening here, and not necessarily compare this to the Cold War situation as it were. I think I overshot my time. Thank you, Zeba.
Not a problem at all. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Tong, I'll go to you next. What do you think this course can offer students who might be interested?
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me congratulate the Stevenson Center for offering this great public service. It has great value for scholars and students across the globe. And to answer your question, I think it is important to study deterrence in Southern Asia, mostly because this is very much understudied in many parts of the world. And in China, I can say with a lot of confidence that the nuclear policy community and the Southern Asia regional policy expert community are two completely separate communities. They don't talk with each other. So it's very hard to find experts who are specialized in both nuclear and Southern Asian issues. And the result is the nuclear deterrence in Southern Asia does not receive sufficient attention at all. But in fact, if we look at Southern Asia, I think there is real risks from unstable nuclear deterrence relationship because the situation in South Asia is relatively unique. You have very serious hostility between India and Pakistan due to long-standing territorial disputes. You have very imbalanced military capabilities, both at the nuclear and conventional level between India and Pakistan. You have very different deterrence postures. India's nuclear deterrence is always described as credible minimum deterrence, whereas Pakistan has full spectrum deterrence. And then you have this extra player, China, that is further complicating the situation, making India worried about two-front threats. So all these factors, I think, make a stable deterrence relationship in Southern Asia very hard to build and to maintain. And so if we want to avoid potential risks from a volatile deterrence relationship, we need to pay more attention and to study this issue more deeply.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, Chris, back to you. From your vantage point, what do you think a course like this can offer?
You know, as an academic, sometimes we like to think about different levels of analysis or levels of conflict. And from my vantage, South Asia's got everything you would want. And Southern Asia even has more of it, right? So if you're interested in how do you defeat and deter terrorism, it's an important aspect of terrorism and deterrence in South Asia. If you're interested in how to stop states from using proxy violence, it's an important aspect of deterrence in Southern Asia. If you care about fait accomplis and limited conflicts, Southern Asia's got that too. If you want to stop full-scale conventional war, well, that's an important issue in Southern Asia. It's one of the few places in the world where full-scale conventional war is planned for on a daily basis. If you're worried about how to stop nuclear war, it's an important aspect of deterrence in Southern Asia. So the other issue is in Southern Asia, all these problems are interrelated, right? We're worried that terrorism will cause a limited war, which is going to cause a full-scale war, which might cause a nuclear war, right? There's all these relationships are put together. And obviously on the eastern side, we just have this problem of a fait accompli that might cause a serious crisis, already has caused a serious crisis, and it's not entirely clear we're out of the woods for a war either. So I study Southern Asia because I know I'll never get bored, and I think the course does a good job of introducing the reasons that is the case.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think you're absolutely right that so many of the issues that might be interested in are kind of compounded and just like interrelated in Southern Asia. Now I'd like to refer back to that core theme of the course that we talked about earlier, which is, again, this evolution of deterrence from the Cold War to modern day Southern Asia. Now, each of you has had a chance to speak to this as lecturers and authors in the course, but I'd like to ask you to revisit that concept today. So how, in your opinion, do you apply traditional Cold War era deterrence theory to a region, again, as Chris was saying, as dynamic and contested and multipolar as 21st century Southern Asia? So let's reverse the question order for this time around. So Chris, if you can kick us off, then we'll go up to Tong, then Happymon, and Rabia at the end.
Yeah, so, the Cold War was the first nuclear age, and then the post-Cold War was the second. We're on the dawn of the third nuclear age now, and this is going to be a multipolar problem, right? So a lot of the solutions for arms racing, which, by the way, the United States is having a lot of trouble with now, because arms racing, it just feels so good. You just want to do it. You want to spend those monies to get your nuclear weapons all tippy-top, and those problems are even worse in a multipolar order. And then on top of those general challenges, those structural challenges in South Asia, we don't have the space that the superpowers had in the Cold War, right? The Cold War superpowers operated, all of their violence was concentrated in the buffer spaces in Asia and Europe. Often quite shitty for the people of Southeast Asia in particular, that the Cold War competition dealt with these buffer spaces, but probably better than the alternative. Whereas here, all three powers are bumping up against each other. There's daily friction. There's problems we've seen on both borders that can create sparks for a crisis, kind of surprisingly, without us necessarily knowing. And then the other thing I think that bears keeping in mind is, compared to the superpowers especially, and their European counterparts, all three powers, to a lesser extent China maybe, have serious development goals that can compete with the military modernization issues, right? India and Pakistan are still poor societies that are emerging into being middle-income countries. And China is a middle-income country that would like to be a wealthy country. And that guns versus butter trade-off, which is present in every society, is especially intense there, right? Where literally, the poverty in India and Pakistan means that money that goes to militaries literally is causing stunting in children, because it's not going to deal with child hunger, right? There are real trade-offs here that were not as serious in the superpower context. And that makes this even more important for us to think about in a serious way.
Thank you, Chris. I believe, Tong, you're up next.
Sure. I think traditional Cold War era deterrence theory has real impact in this region. As latecomers to the nuclear club, they turn to learn from the former superpowers. At least I think China certainly did. Chinese nuclear thinking has been increasingly influenced by American and Russian nuclear doctrine and deterrence thinking. And India and Pakistan, they became nuclear capable even later, much later than China did. But I think there is increasing evidence that they are also increasingly affected by the American and Russian deterrence thinking. In some areas, the traditional deterrence theory impact is really obvious. All the regional countries, they are today very much fixated on securing their second strike capability. They're deeply concerned about any possible threat from the enemy about conducting a preemptive strike. And this makes states in this region a little hard to escape the security dilemma. Of course, some elements of the traditional deterrence theory takes longer time in some countries to have an impact. Like in China, a country that traditionally doesn't study the issue of escalation risks. It takes longer time for Chinese experts to gradually learn from the US and the Russian experiences. I think that said, we have to understand that South Asia is a very unique region, and many elements of the traditional deterrence theory won't readily apply. And we need a comprehensive consideration of all factors, including history, culture, military capabilities, postures, domestic political features, and various threat perceptions in regional states. And even geography matters a lot. So I think we have to be really aware of the uniqueness of Southern Asia.
Wonderful, Tong. Happyman, you're up next. There you go.
Thank you, Zeba. I think one of the things that strikes you, as you set out to study how theoreticians, academics in Southern Asia think about nuclear deterrence, is that most of the region's deterrence theories and practices have been schooled in the vast literature produced by the Cold War writers. You talk to anyone in Islamabad, in Delhi, I don't know much about Beijing, but in the region, we do refer to authors, writers, and concepts from the Cold War, vintage, as it were. So many of the basic assumptions, and I'll sort of caveat this when I say this. So many of the basic assumptions, concepts, and language of nuclear talk in Southern Asia are assumed to be pretty similar to Cold War. Assumed to be because I think it's only up to a point and not beyond that. So Cold War literature, in some sense, acts as a guidebook to those in the region studying nuclear deterrence in many ways. So you look at what they talked about during the Cold War years, how they sort of went about developing their systems, what are the most important things, what are the terms that they use. So there is a tendency to study that, even though the spin on some of those things will be very different in the region, and that makes it important for for others to look very specifically at how they're conceived of in the region. So they may talk about stability, but their understanding of stability may differ in this particular region. So I think, therefore, it is not easy to apply traditional Cold War deterrence theory to nuclear Southern Asia without being simplistic about it. I mean, just to give you an example, there are no existential worries in contemporary South Asia about a nuclear war. Unlike, say, in the US-USSR context, the concepts such as mutually assured destruction or balance of terror, these were very key to maintaining strategic stability between Cold War rivals, as conceived of and stipulated by the stability theories of the Cold War years. They don't have much currency in this particular region, certainly not at this point of time. But to sort of caveat the point that I made earlier, I participate in a number of India-Pakistan Tractive initiatives, so do Rabia, from Pakistan, and I'm surprised to see the amount of differences that exist among the Indians and Pakistani participants on concepts, on the meaning of various terms, etc., etc. So I think one has to be very careful about how to apply these concepts and maxims from the Cold War vintage to Southern Asia in general. Thank you, Zeba.
Thank you, everyone. And I think your point about not doing this in a simplistic manner is especially well taken, and one that we are certainly very conscious of as we were building this course. I will now turn to Rabia to close out this first question.
I'll be brief, Zeba, because I think my fellow panelists have very aptly, answered this question. So deterrence has evolved since the Cold War, and so has the security environment post-nuclearization in South Asia. So while the existential nature of deterrence remains, the traditional Cold War lens is no longer, in my mind, the right framework to analyze the South Asian strategic dynamics. We have seen that during the Cold War, nuclear weapons influenced and were influenced by the rivalry between the US and Soviet Union. We saw the theory of deterrence evolve and take shape. In our region, I believe Pakistan and India have co evolved, and so have their deterrent responses towards each other. The one application that will remain true for all times to come when we talk about deterrence is the aspect of its failure and the unprecedented risk posed by that failure to the human species. That to me is the only constant. While the world in general and South Asia in particular should be taking steps towards preventing failure of deterrence, we see the reverse happening. We see states trying to gain an edge by adding to their destructive capacity of their nuclear weapons, by developing nuclear weapons that are smaller in yield and can be used in battlefield for the belief that it would augment or strengthen their deterrence vis-a-vis their adversary. So the 21st century South Asia, which you rightly characterized as becoming multipolar due to the presence of extra-regional forces like the US and other countries, forming military alliances to counter China, add to the complexity of deterrence in our region, something which did not exist during the Cold War, when symmetry and parity between US and Soviet Union allowed deterrence to flourish and thrive between the two. So characterized by increasing asymmetry between the three nuclear states in the region, there are less and less guarantees that deterrence will survive and not break down. So that's my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. That's really useful. Now I'd like to ask our panelists from Southern Asia to expand on this theme a little bit more closely. Some of you touched on it in your previous responses, but I will go ahead and ask the more explicit question, which is, what deterrence lessons from the Cold War do you think are most applicable to modern day Southern Asia, and which the least? Happy Mom, can we start with you and then go to Rabia and then kick it off to Tong?
Thank you, Zeba. I think we already had some of the discussion during the previous Q&A, but I think clearly, very commonsensically putting it, one important lesson is that, hey, nuclear weapons are not regular weapons. They are dangerous weapons, so handle them with care. I think we sort of understood that. All the three countries, in many ways, although in different degrees, I would say, have sort of come to terms with the logic that nuclear weapons are not regular weapons. So there is a desire to handle them with care. And also, I think the dictum that nuclear weapons are supposed to provide you with a certain amount of existential security. And I think certainly in the Indian strategic thinking, that is taken as an important sacrosanct doctrine, as it were. Perhaps a little less in the Pakistani sort of thinking, and I believe in the Chinese thinking as well. This is seen as providing you with a certain amount of existential security. This is not for everyday security purposes, right? This is not something that will stop an incursion here, an incursion there, a conflict there, or a conflict here. This is not meant for that. And I think what is perhaps not applicable, and again, I'm probably exaggerating when I sort of make these observations in the South Asian context from the Cold War deterrence lessons, is that I think nuclear deterrence producing, or the presence of nuclear weapons producing a certain urgency in the minds of decision makers to seek stability. I think this was something that we saw after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Soviet-US context. This is not something that we see in the Southern Asian context. There are nuclear weapons, there are conflicts, there are all kinds of conflicts happening, and yet there are nuclear talks, nuclear threats, being traded back and forth, and yet we don't see a certain amount of urgency in the minds of decision makers to seek stability. Now, this lack of enthusiasm about nuclear weapons is both, I would say, comforting and worrying. It's comforting because it is really, you may talk about it, but it's not something you're not going to use at the end of the day. It's worrying because, hey, if you are not worried about nuclear weapons, you're not really going to talk about it in a constructive manner and sort of get into CBMs, etc. about that. The other lesson, I think, again, from post Cuban Missile Crisis, Cold War, was that countries the two sides will get into certain NCBMs, the presence of nuclear weapons, and the possibility that nuclear weapons can sort of take you to nuclear conflict could potentially prompt you to have nuclear CBMs, is really not something that I guess we have learned here. There are hardly any nuclear CBMs that are happening. There are a couple, but beyond that, we don't have many meaningful nuclear CBMs, as it were. Now, nuclear weapons are also, I would say, in the classical literature, supposed to dampen the risk-taking propensity among states. That is not what we are seeing in Southern Asia, at least. On the contrary, we see a certain amount of risk-taking tendency fueled by the presence of nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons are not really leading to stability here. On the contrary, it is sort of making situation a little unstable here. And also, again, as Chris pointed out earlier, there is a certain, I think, a lack of focus on perfecting the deterrence game in Southern Asia. I think one of the reasons, as again he pointed out, we are developing countries and there is a cash crunch here. On the question of dyad, on doctrines, second strike capability, etc. I think there's a slow momentum towards that. There is no sense of urgency here to accomplish all of that. So the question is whether this will then lead to less than perfect command and control, less than perfect systems, etc. So that's a worrying part, because we've sort of in some ways taken it pretty easy when it comes to nuclear weapons. And finally, I think this is something that can be debated, but I think the whole issue of mutual vulnerability that the nuclear deterrence theory sort of proposed as a precondition for stability to exist. We are seeing a certain amount of increasing desire to move away from that doctrine and sort of make oneself more and more invulnerable. I think that is going to complicate the whole stability conversation around here. Thank you, Seba.
Thank you, everyone. I believe Rabia is up next.
Great question, Zeba. Again, I'll be brief. I'll start with the least. So we in South Asia cannot mirror image that symmetry and parity that existed between the Cold War nuclear rivals, and that is the most dangerous characteristics of modern day South Asia. That symmetry was the hallmark of stability. That parity between US and Soviet Union pushed the Cold War rivals towards exploring arms control approaches and mechanisms. So we don't have that in South Asia. That's, to me, is the least applicable thing right now. The most applicable still remains fear. Fear of mutual annihilation is still central and will remain so. As long as countries have strategic pheromones in place, deterrence will live, survive, and thrive. However, that alone, I believe, is no guarantor of peace in the region, because like I said earlier, drivers of instability that would in time allow for the breakdown of deterrence are greater than the drivers of stability that would ensure deterrence survives. And that's an unfortunate reality of our region, but reality nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. Very sobering points. Tong, would you like to go next?
I don't necessarily disagree with Rabia. I agree that in the Cold War, there was nuclear parity between US and the Soviet Union. But I think what was applicable is even during the Cold War, there was, during some time period, there was conventional asymmetry between the two superpowers. And I think there are useful lessons that we can learn from that because today we also have conventional asymmetry between India and Pakistan. How the conventionally superior actor should be careful not to conduct military operations in ways that may look like a preparation for a preemptive military strike, and how the conventionally inferior actor should not overreact and should build effective nuclear command control system so that top political leaders will remain full control and not be misguided by false alarms. I think those lessons can be very helpful to today's Southern Asia. What is not applicable, I think there are many. During the Cold War, the extended deterrence is a major theme. How to reassure allies is a major requirement for effective deterrence. And that I don't think is applicable to South Asia. India today faces two-front threats from both China and Pakistan. That's certainly unique. And also both China and India today have no first use policy, and that didn't exist between United States and Soviet Union. And today in Southern Asia, external great powers like US and Russia, they can to some extent step in and mediate in a serious military crisis in this region. That's also different during the Cold War. So because of this uniqueness, I think we particularly need to study deterrence in Southern Asia.
Thank you all. Again, really edifying comments from all of you. And I'd like to now, Tong, you brought up the great power competition just now. So Chris, I'd like to ask your thoughts on that specifically. Can you walk us through kind of the US role in the strategic chain in Southern Asia and its view of competition in the Indo-Pacific? So how, if at all, has the US perspective shifted since the debut of the Indo-Pacific strategy? And looking forward a little bit, what do you think is in store for US engagement in this region under an incoming, perhaps, Biden administration?
I worked in the US government a long time ago in the George W. Bush administration. And I think if you asked me what our South Asia strategy was then, I would tell you there was basically a strategy centered around Pakistan designed to win the Afghan war. And there was a separate strategy centered around India designed to help manage the rise of China. And those strategies were not particularly closely linked. And in fact, they generated a fair amount of friction. And eventually they just sort of like separated the offices of those of us that worked on India from Pakistan. So we didn't have to talk to each other. We just could kind of ignore the problem. And in general, I would say the US government doesn't do a great job, absent crisis, of thinking about this, because the US doesn't want to, if you're a participant in a competition, you don't want to think that the security dilemma is like a real problem for you, because you're a good guy, you're a good guy. So the United States doesn't like to think about the security dilemma very much vis-a-vis China. And so we don't think that our missile defenses and counterforce are causing Chinese modernization. And China is focused on the United States and doesn't really want to think that what it's doing is causing India any heartache. And India knows that it has a no first use strategy. It wouldn't dream of bad thoughts. And so why would Pakistan be worried about those things, right? So each leg wants to convince itself that it is not the problem. It's the other states that are the problem, right? Now, if I think about US strategy going forward, the United States government has more or less given up on winning the war in Afghanistan, right? We haven't quite said all those things out loud, but that's the reality. And then the question is like, what is our minimal goal? Are we trying to prevent Afghanistan from metastasizing into something that can directly harm the United States? Or do we think we can just, if we can get a face-saving way out, that's sufficient, right? We can manage the Afghan risk from afar. So Pakistan is important today for US ambitions in the region, but it's much less important for US policymakers than it was a decade ago. I think that calculation is a little off, frankly, but I think that's the reality. And in a way, Pakistan's a victim of its own success in suppressing terrorism domestically, right? Pakistan had a really, really serious terrorism problem a decade ago. It was basically in what political scientists would call a civil war, even though there was lots of stability around the country. There was enough violence to meet most of the definitions of civil war. And Pakistan has essentially suppressed 90% of that, right? It's in a much better place. And with India, the US concerns about China have only grown. And that's true for both parties. So even if Trump pulls off his coup or if Biden goes into office on January 20th, the China concerns are going to be right there in the center of the U.S. strategic universe. And in fact, I think what we're going to see is an enormous amount of continuity in the policy. You won't see all the mad tweeting and things, but I suspect that if you plucked Trump's long-suffering NSC senior director for South Asia, Lisa Curtis, out of the Trump White House and plopped her in the Biden White House, she would do just fine, right? The policy, she would fit in just perfectly okay in the policy discussions, as would Alice Wells, who is the long acting assistant secretary in South and Central Asian affairs. So we're going to see a lot of continuity, though some of the trends on Afghanistan and China will only amplify in the next 4 years.
Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. Now, we have about 20 minutes left, so I encourage people in the audience to submit questions so we can get to them. As we wait for those to come in, I will ask a couple more of my own, and since we are running a little low on time, or a little behind on time, sorry, I'll ask the participants to be as judicious as possible in their responses. So I'll start with Happy One and Tong. I'd like you both to speak to something that you have a little bit before, I've gestured to before, but to go into it more specifically, which is this ongoing India-China border standoff. So Tong, I'll start with you. Over the past year, we've seen increasingly assertive behavior from China across different areas and domains, whether Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, and of course, this border standoff with India. What do you think this says about the state of deterrence in Southern Asia? Is this a deterrence breakdown, and what role will this play in what Chris was talking about in terms of seemingly intensifying competition?
That's a great question. I think the good news is the nuclear deterrence between China and India didn't break down. There is no serious concern about escalation of the border conflict to the nuclear level, so that's good. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that deterrence has worked either. Because there is no serious risk of escalation, probably because there are very important shared strategic interests to avoid major wars between the two powers. The political leaders in both Delhi and Beijing certainly want to maintain some stable relationship at the political level. And they want to maintain their, well, at least in the Chinese case, there is an interest in maintaining economic interdependence. They don't want to lose the other side as a potential partner in the future geopolitical game. So maybe the lack of serious risk of escalation is due to the shared and very important political interests to escalate and to avoid major wars. I think deterrence didn't really work to prevent conventional conflicts, and certainly the border clash in Galwan Valley was the most deadly in more than 50 years between the two countries. But I think the biggest challenge to a stable deterrence relationship between China and India is the fact that both countries, just as Chris has said, both in this case, both China and India see itself as trying to protect the status quo and see the other side as trying to change the status quo. China felt India started changing the status quo by revoking the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, and the Indian Home Minister made statements about the territorial dispute. And from the Indian perspective, China tried to change the status quo by moving more troops to the disputed border, etc. So the result is India feels that deterrence may have failed. And China also didn't think that its deterrence has worked. So with this perception gap, if this perception gap continues, I think it is only going to drive towards more intense competition between the two countries and make their deterrence relationship more challenging to maintain.
Thank you, Tong. Again, very sobering points, but I think you're pointing towards the perception gap between India and China is particularly prescient and important. Happy one, relatedly, given recent reports about China's advancement along the disputed LAC, what does this mean for India's hopes of deterring future incursions? What options do you think India still has to bring the situation under control?
I tend to agree with Tong that there is no deterrence breakdown here. I think what has broken down is clearly political trust and long-tested military cooperation between the two militaries, the PLA and the Indian Army on the line of actual control. So, I mean, from an Indian point of view, clearly, China is in occupation of territory that was previously in the Indian possession. From an Indian point of view, there is no doubt about that. But given the fact that this is a contested border and the status quo previously established by the two sides has broken down, I think we are probably going to see a repetition of this in the years to come. This is probably not in my opinion, the end of the skirmishes that we are going to witness on the LAC. The good news, of course, is that the Sino-Indian conflict is remain at the level that we witnessed recently. It is unlikely to escalate to higher levels, certainly not to the strategic level. And again, I agree with Tong that both sides clearly want to avoid a shooting war between the two sides. I don't think this it suits India, it suits China. Clearly, there are very, very high economic costs involved. There are domestic political audience costs involved. So what you're likely to see is a long Cold War, perhaps, if the two sides do not sort of break this logjam and build a trust back. We're going to see a long Cold War as it were. So while the existence of security is guaranteed by nuclear weapons from an Indian point of view, what I think India really needs is a strategy to counter a Chinese salami slicing strategies, as it were. And as Chris pointed out earlier, the whole issue of fait accompli. I mean, India has been handed a fait accompli, and if India is going to be handed more fait accomplis in future, that's going to be unacceptable. This time around, the Prime Minister didn't really make an issue of it, and therefore it's sort of the two sides are able to get into a conversation. But this is not going to continue for a long time, certainly not the next time. As for options, you asked me, Zeba, and I think at the tactical level, perhaps one option that India could have is to sort of capture weakly defended Chinese positions and then perhaps use them as bargaining chips. The LSE is not as if every inch is manned by the PLA and the Indian Army. There are weakly defended positions on both sides. So next time around, this is perhaps something that the Indian Army could try. But I think at the more strategic level, India needs to invest in a more ambitious maritime strategy, as it were, and perhaps join forces with like-minded states, like in the Quad, or say with the United States. And you are witnessing actually precisely that to the Malabar exercise. You have Australia being invited, and you see a slew of US-India defense deals defense agreements being signed. So China may have actually unwittingly pushed India to the United States to forge a closer partnership with the United States. And thirdly, I think from an Indian point of view, I personally believe that New Delhi should try and break up this two-front situation. You have a two-front situation, break it up. Now, how do you sort of break it up? I think the easy way to break it up is perhaps to sort of one, pacify Kashmir in some sense, and perhaps sort of reach out to Pakistan and create a certain conversation going with Islamabad. But I don't think there is any amount of appetite for that in New Delhi. Primarily, I think because of the domestic audience course, as it were. Thank you, Zeba.
Thank you, everyone. All right, I have two last questions, one each for Rabia and Chris, where I'll ask you both to assess strategy and deterrence in the subcontinent, and then with that, I will go to our audience questions. So, Rabia, I'll start with you. So, Rebecca Hersman, who is a fellow Deterrence in Southern Asia lecturer, recently wrote an article about what she calls wormhole escalation, positing that there's a new nuclear paradox emerging because of increased competition in the gray zone, and that might collapse rungs in our traditional conception of the escalation ladder and create holes in deterrence. Now, you wrote in response to Hirschman's article that, I quote, Pakistan needs to undertake doctrinal changes to redesign its conventional and nuclear thresholds, unquote. So I was wondering, what changes do you think that Pakistan would consider, and what exactly would you recommend? And because we are now at about 10 minutes, I'd encourage you to answer that very weighty question as quickly as you can.
Thank you so much, Zeba. If you're looking for a sophisticated response, then I might not have it, because by the time I made that statement and wrote that piece, I haven't had much time to tease it out. But here is what I have. Rebecca's article was fascinating. It was a very, very long read, though. She looks at the changing landscape of escalation and how it will come about and perceived between adversaries, and questions the validity and the utility of Khan's 44-rung escalation ladder, which until now was continuous and linear. While for some it remains continuous and linear, I agree with Rebecca that the gray zones in which the AI-generated, fabricated deep fake news, for example, operates will complicate the universally shared conceptions of deterrence. And that's what's important to me. Across the full spectrum of conflict, the cross-domain coercion tools that she mentions are available to states. They are numerous and impactful. She's talked about digital soldiers and how nuclear powers can now engage their adversaries' core strategic interests directly, coercively, and below the traditional form of armed conflict, as well as we all know it and theorized about it. This makes me think about Pakistan's conventional and nuclear thresholds, which are pretty much unambiguous because they have been so talked about that almost everyone knows them to be only spatial, military, political, and economic. While I cannot say if Pakistan's strategic planners have thought of more, I would certainly recommend that they think to expand them to include the gray zones Rebecca refers to, especially since for the first time in the history of its 73 years of existence with India, much of it uncomfortable and hostile, Pakistan is dealing with an ideologically motivated state with militarized Hindutva ideology seeping in almost every level of a society, be it political or strategic. And for this, Pakistan is still developing a playbook. So while we are thinking about our political responses towards BJP RSS led India, we need to develop responses for a military that also operates the same civilian leadership, which is dangerously ideological and anti Muslim in character. So we need to think of all the scenarios whereby this militarized Hindutva nationalism, as the driver of India's political and strategic doctrine, can make things difficult for Pakistan. So it is important for Pakistan to understand this philosophy, since it has a direct bearing on how Modi Shah BJP is handling its present crisis in Kashmir, or how it will handle any future crisis between India and Pakistan. So the thresholds are bound to change and must change to accommodate this ideology, which it can accomplish. And since Rebecca's article was the frame of reference for my statement, which you quoted, I see information-based cyber attacks having the potential to upset the escalation hierarchy during the next Indo-Pak crisis. And since they have the potential, they need to make their way into Pakistan's strategic calculus. And for that, I recommended in my talk that Pakistan's nuclear threshold would need to be redefined and restudied in that context to include how disruptive technologies will impact Pakistan's conventional and nuclear responses. Offensive posturing or strategy against hostile use of technologies will need to be developed. And if hostile use of technology is not part of Pakistan's red line, then it needs to become one. If cyber attack has not become part of Pakistan's red line, if it still falls below the threshold of the use of force, then it needs to be revisited. And we as academics in Pakistan need to ask, are there new kinds of threats to Pakistan's national security emanating from all that we have talked about? Yes. Are they asymmetric in nature but can have strategic consequences? Yes. Then Pakistan needs to rethink its deterrence strategy in the cyber age, in the age of disruptive techs, bordering a country like India, which has shown time and again how capable it is of using fake news to incite new forms of nationalism to achieve political and strategic objectives. And US, through its posture review of 2018, has made it easier for other countries to think about new forms of retaliation, blurring the lines between conventional and nuclear responses to threats that are not strategic in nature. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. I know I've certainly been thinking a lot about technology and media and escalation dangers, a lot. So really illuminating for me. Now, Chris, I will ask you my last question and then finally turn to our audience questions. So you and Vipin Narang at MIT wrote early last year that India appears to be rethinking its NFU posture and maybe pursuing a counterforce nuclear strategy. Since that article was written, how would you assess Indian nuclear strategy now, and how would this impact deterrence in Southern Asia today?
Thanks, Zeba. First, I wanted to just, when Rabia was talking, I've been spending a lot of time recently looking back at old archival documents. And one of the earlier set of meetings between India and Pakistan was there was a consultative committee where they would meet to complain about press articles that appeared in the other countries. And these consultative committees met for years. And I would just say that I think Rabia is right that there are new challenges that are emerging now. But the problem of fake news in South Asia as a driver of crisis really goes back to the very first days of basically the rumors that surrounded partition, right? That's a very old problem, which has new clothes, no doubt. As to your question about Vipin and my article, which is available for free, you should go look at it, India's Counterforce Temptations. What we argued is there are some technological developments that have made counterforce technology tempting for India. And we see some evidence that at least some important Indians have been arguing that India should pursue those paths. And we think that's not great. We understand the logic, which is that it is very desirous for a stronger conventional state to want to find ways to get rid of nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is very uncomfortable. It's very unpleasant. The United States struggles all the time with North Korea. We would love not to have to deal with this little tiny North Korea that causes us heartache, and we'd love to find a way to escape this problem. And India is also experiencing some of those urges. And it is easy to tell yourself a story that you need to give policymakers options in the event of a very serious crisis that are other than having to back down or accept the potential destruction of Indian cities. Okay? That's a very daunting strategic problem that Indian policymakers face. And we say that those temptations are there and encourage maybe India to rethink them. And the point I would like to make about that piece is I don't think India can succeed in counterforce targeting. I think it's a fool's errand. I think it's a waste of resources. And I would make that point also to my Pakistani counterparts, that those Indian developments are manageable with relatively low-cost countermeasures. And now Pakistan will have to invest in those countermeasures. And some of those countermeasures are going to be kind of dangerous for all of us, likely involving dispersion of nuclear assets early in a crisis. I don't love it. And I'd rather India signal more clearly than it has that it is not going to go down the counterforce path. We'll see how that space develops. But I think there are a lot of options still on the table, despite the difficulties of structural arms control in South Asia. There is an opportunity for creative thinking. I'll just use the last second of my comments to say, I would love to see more creative thinking coming out of India and Pakistan about a way to decrease the amount of armored forces deployed on the border. The Indian and Pakistani militaries are still fundamentally World War II in some ways and how they're arrayed against each other. It is a waste of money. Those strike corps that Sundarji made are never going to be used. And India would be much better placed to deal with this challenge with China, to deal with the 21st century, if it could figure out how to decrease the number of tanks on its border by 20 and 30% and get Pakistan to do the same. And at a time when both countries are facing COVID austerity, when they are going to deal with serious decreases in their GDP for the next year or two, I would hope that there's some creative thinking about getting away from militaries that are designed to fight wars from the 1950s and 60s and get ready for wars for the 2020s.
Thank you, Chris. I know that austerity and the economic issues plaguing both countries are only going to get worse in the next couple of years. So again, points very well taken. Now, one of our audience members, Pranav Satyanath from RSIS, has a question, I believe, for any panelists who would like to take it. how should scholars think through deterrence as a non-dyadic relationship, and what are pointers for further research? So we've covered this in some fashion earlier on today, but that is one question. And then our second question from our own Samir Lawani, also for all panelists, is what is a particularly interesting deterrence puzzle or area of research on strategy, South Asia or Southern Asia or not, that you're hoping to explore in the future? So Tong, would you like to answer either question? Both?
Sure. So on the question of looking beyond dyad nuclear relationship, I think one point I want to make is it's really important for countries to take a holistic approach in thinking about these issues. I'm afraid today this has not happened. China is still looking at its nuclear relationship with India in a very related manner, in the sense that China feels it doesn't worry about India's nuclear capability, so it shouldn't pay attention. It doesn't realize the fact that India is still paying much attention to China's nuclear modernization. And India continues to modernize partly because of China's nuclear program. And that Indian modernization is going to put pressure on Pakistan. So in some sense, Chinese modernization is helping widen the gap between India and Pakistan in their strategic military capabilities. And that gap is not in Chinese interests. China doesn't want to see this gap growing, which threatens the stability on the subcontinent. And China worries about its political and economic impact. But China hasn't connected these issues together. So I think the first step is for the governments to look at the entire situation in a more holistic manner, to recognize the linkages between the different dyads.
Thank you, Tony. I think again the strategic chain question and knock-on effects, I'm sorry, is one that we reckon with very seriously in the course, and that we believe that a lot of analysts should be doing more intentionally. Rabia, do you have a response to either the dyad question or the deterrence puzzle question?
Yeah, I would like to, briefly respond to the deterrence puzzle question by Samir. I think it's important for us, all researchers, academics, to continue to think. And what worries me about South Asia and the deterrence dynamics is the role of third party, its influence in stabilizing the crisis between India and Pakistan. And I continue to wonder, and I think that would be a main area of research for me. I encourage my students to think about these as well, as to how long will it take the both countries to develop bilateral mechanisms and deal with their own crisis. I also wonder that in the absence of third party, what escalatory patterns are going to play out, and how far will India and Pakistan go to test each other out before they realize that they need to de-escalate, and what would be the drivers for that. So I think for me, this one area, because it's so huge, and I continue to say that crisis stability is the one that is extremely important, for deterrent stability to exist, and then overall feeds into strategic stability. So this is one area which continues to puzzle me, and I hope more and more research goes into this so that we break away from the dependency that both countries have developed over a period of years on third parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. Chris, any last thoughts in response to either question?
No, I still find the region fascinating, and I think there's really important issues. And I think what students, it's either whether they're coming to the material for the first time or whether they're experienced, as they go through the course, they're going to figure out there's still lots of gaps. There are things we don't know. There are lessons that we've learned from the Cold War that were wrong, that we made mistakes in learning for the Southern Asian environment. And so we have a lot of work to do. And my own work right now is looking a lot about what domestic political pressures there are to escalate in a crisis. I think it's clear that Indian, Pakistani, and to a lesser extent Chinese leaders often say, for reasons of honor, they're compelled to escalate. But what do those pressures really look like? That's something I'm trying to tease out now, and some work I'm doing with colleagues. And but honestly, there are so many different directions for scholars to go in. And as we sort of talked about at the outset, it's along with understanding perhaps Northeast Asia, North Korea, and other things, this is a really still a very substantively meaningful part of the world to try to understand, because the dangers are not merely theoretical. There are in the last months, people have died because of political choices on both the Sino-Indian and the Indo-Pakistani borders. And that is remarkable given the fact that they're two nuclear dyads. And I don't see things getting much better in the coming years, sadly. So we have our work cut out for us.
Again, sobering comments, but I think very well taken. Happy Man, I'll give you the last opportunity to respond to either question with any final thoughts.
Right. I think I'll take the question about the non-dyadic sort of deterrent situations in South Asia. I think that's an interesting area to focus on, to research on, because for a very long time, it was all South Asia, right? It was India, Pakistan dyad. The entire focus was on that. There's a little focus on India, China. In fact, China refused to talk to India on strategic matters, meaning nuclear issues. In fact, in track 2 dialogues, when we insisted on having a Chinese voice there was little interest in that. But suddenly, I think there's a certain awakening in the region that, hey, you are actually looking at a non-dyadic sort of a relationship. You're looking at a trilemma, as it were. So I think we need to sort of look at it carefully and see at what level are we going to sort of look at it and analyze. For instance, from the way I see, there is very little fear in Delhi about a nuclear ganging up between, say, China and Pakistan. I mean, put together, China and Pakistan would probably have about 500 nuclear weapons. India has clearly much less. Is there a fear of not having that parity with these two countries? I don't think there is any fear of that kind. So where does the fear exist? I think the fear is really in terms of a conventional ganging up, right? I mean, if you have really a situation going on with China on the LAC, and if Pakistan puts pressure from the other side, I think this is going to be difficult for India to handle, and of course, intelligence sharing and things of that kind. The other aspect, I think, when it comes to a trilemma or three powers involved in a conflict, 3 countries involved in a conflict, is again something that Rabia talked about earlier. Which is, what role would a third party play in a sort of situation where India and Pakistan are involved in a conflict? Say, for example, the Kargil conflict, the Americans played the role of a mediator. Now, if China is involved in this particular conflict with India and China on the one side and Pakistan on the other, what role will the United States play? Can the United States play the mediator role at all? So I think these are again open questions. I think trilemma brings in its own complications. I think we should be aware of that. I just want to sort of take just 30 seconds to sort of talk about the issue that Rabia raised about ideology and strategy. The way I see it, I do not really think that there is any utility in sort of looking at, say, India's nuclear strategy or even conventional military strategy towards Pakistan or China through the ideological prism. Just like I would say that I never believed that religious radicalization in Pakistan was influencing Pakistan's nuclear strategy vis-a-vis India. I don't think that is, at least that's how I sort of look at it, and I don't think ideology has that overbearing influence on strategy in South Asia. These are really, may I say, rational actor deterrence models in many ways in operation. Thank you, Zeba.
Thank you, everyone. We are now over time, so I will close out this event with a massive thank you to all of our panelists and to Samir and the team and everyone in the audience for joining. This has been a really fantastic conversation, but it's just the tip of the iceberg So if this conversation has intrigued you, if there are elements of it you're interested in exploring, or if there's theory or concepts that you want to brush up on, I cannot encourage you enough to go to stratlearning.org and enroll in Deterrence in Southern Asia. This course is useful and fun, I dare say, and unique as an offering. So I really hope you'll enjoy it and enjoy engaging with these scholars and so many more. It's been my pleasure to moderate this morning. Thank you again so much for joining us. For those of you celebrating, happy Diwali, and for everyone, have a fantastic rest of your Friday and weekend. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, and happy Diwali.